Hi everybody, and welcome to this edition of Capricorn Radio, broadcasting today from the town of Bushmills. Our aim here at Capricorn Radio is to discuss topical science, ancient history and historical mysteries in an effort to unveil our true cultural blueprint. If you haven't checked out the website just yet, please do so at capricornradio.com, and there you can subscribe for show releases, news updates and follow the links on the homepage for Facebook, YouTube and the podcast channel. All shows will be archived on capricornradio.com, and you can check out upcoming guests, their biographies, and please get in touch there if you have any comments or guest suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Today I'll be discussing the work of Shannon Dory, an academic researcher of the Dogon Tribe in West Africa. The Dogon have been popularised by Robert Temple in his book The Sirius Mystery and their links to star knowledge. So let me see, can I get Shannon Dory on the line? So I have with me now on the line Shannon Dory, author of The Master of Speech, The Nummo and Day of the Fish, a Dogon research trilogy of books. Shannon's provided a wealth of information on the Dogon through her own unique research. There isn't a lot of people who have researched the Dogon, so let me see if I got Shannon on the line. Hello, Shannon.
Hi there. How are you today?
Good. Welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Thank you.
Shannon, just before we get into any details, I'm going to just want to go through some of your background and what got you into Dogon research, really.
Well, I began my career as a journalist, and I have a combined history and English degree from Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, in Canada. Mm-hmm. I became interested in religious studies when I took a course on the New Testament at the University of Windsor in 91. And right. I've always had an interest in ufology. My father was a lawyer for the Canadian Air Force, and he was interested in aliens, extraterrestrials, UFOs, things of that nature, and this passion of his rubbed off on me. So I kind of had this interest in this, and when I was researching an article on Y2K back in 1999, I happened to stumble across a website that talked about the Dogon, and this was my first introduction to the Dogon people. And this website talked about the fact that the Dogon had advanced knowledge of the solar system. And they particularly referred to Sirius B, which is the white dwarf star that rotates around Sirius A. Mm-hmm. And the Dogon knew all the properties of this star, and that it was small and it was heavy and white. And they told the anthropologists back in the 30s and 40s that they had got this knowledge from amphibious beings who came from the stars to Earth. And it was this information about this white dwarf star, and this star is so difficult to observe even through a telescope that no photographs were taken of it until 1970, but the Dogon knew everything about it. And so this inspired me to order Marcel Griaul's book Conversations with Ogatamali. Right. Now, this book was recorded in 1946 by the French anthropologist Marcel Griaul, and he recorded it in 33 days, and the Dogon elder that taught it to him was Ogatamali, and he had been introduced into this religion when he was 15 years old, and by his grandfather, and then after his grandfather passed away, his father had taken over the instruction, and according to Marcel Griaul, it went on for over 20 years. So this gives you some idea of the complexity of this religion. Mm-hmm. It was created in an oral culture. The symbols in Conversations with Ogatamali are the main symbols of this religion, and you can't read this book like you would read literature in our culture, because this is totally different. It's an oral culture, and it's all about the symbols and memory work and how these symbols interrelate with other symbols. And you have to realize that this is all memory work. This religion was passed on through these stories, through memorization, and so, it's quite involved. And, this was the only game in town. This would have been their only source of literature, so to speak, in an oral culture. So my research shows that this is basically the oldest religion in the world. I've compared it against other religions, and to me, this is the most important historical source document we have in the world today, because it was recorded when the religion was still being practiced, and it was recorded in a language that we can understand today. We're not dealing with dead languages. We're not dealing with artifacts and trying to piece together what happened based on fragments that we pull out of the ground. This came right from this Dogon elder who knew his religion, who was teaching it the way it had been taught to him. So this is a very important historical record.
Sure, and I think the significance of the Dogon religion and culture that I synchronise with the sense of importance portrayed in the book, Shannon. I really did very early on. I don't think you can emphasise that enough. The significance of what these guys have to tell us, like, and the fact that it against all the odds, it survived, like.
Yeah. Well, it was stamped out of most places in the world because the importance of this religion is that the Nummo, who are these amphibious aliens that the Dogon talk about, were hermaphrodites, but they were associated with the sacred feminine. And we know from research of Maria Gimbutas and Joseph Campbell, Robert Graves, and others that the earliest religions in the world were worship the goddess. So this is a very old religion, and unfortunately in most places of the world, Joseph Campbell referred to this in his books, that these symbols become reversed because he talks about these warring tribes, these patriarchal tribes that come down and they conquer these peaceful goddess worshipping civilizations, and they don't like the fact that the female is the main deity, so they reverse all the symbols. And when you reverse these symbols, you lose the fact that the Nummo were hermaphrodites. Mm-hmm. And the female becomes designated to the symbol of the moon, which in the Dogon religion is associated with the single-sex male and the first human, and the evil in the Dogon religion, who is identified with the jackal. And so Joseph Campbell refers to this period in history as solarization, where you have the reversal of all these symbols. And unfortunately, when Marcel Griol was recording the religion, he identified the Nummo as male. And he admitted he never really understood the religion. And it's fortunate for us that he did record it fairly accurately, because the symbols are there. And the symbols tell us that the Nummo were female deities.
You mentioned Marcel Griol there. Just for the listeners, Shannon, let's go back to their research, because this is where I think the story and the dedication and research starts for you, because, as you say, the conversation with Ogo Tameli, stuff that has happened after that event probably, and Marcel Griol's research probably gets somewhat affected by modern society, and for you, that's where the core of research really starts. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, part of the problem was that because he didn't identify the Nummo as female, that this research has sort of gotten lost. There aren't a lot of scholars working on the Dogon religion, which is tragic, because to me it's the source religion. And Marcel Griol can't be faulted for that, because he grew up in a patriarchal culture himself. I mean, when the French took over this area of Africa, the Dogon probably knew that their time was limited, and pretty soon they wouldn't be able to practice this religion. So Marcel Griol had lived amongst them for 15 years, and he kept trying to figure out the basis of the religion, and they would be vague about certain points. So it was only in 1946 that they actually told him the core symbols of this religion, and he never really did ever understand the Dogon religion. He admitted that. He recorded it as Ogo Tameli told it to him, but he never understood it. And part of this is because it came from an oral culture, and the symbols are what tell the story. It doesn't follow a chronological pattern the way we are used to reading stuff. Right. It's interrelated through the symbols, and I believe it's a metaphor for immortality, because everything is interrelated. Time is really insignificant, and it's hard from that regard to identify certain time periods. You have to piece it together. It's like a giant puzzle that you have to try to figure out how it all fits into the history.
In the book Conversation with Ogo Tameli, let's talk about this guy, Ogo Tameli, because inevitably the structure of the oral history is kind of somewhat unaffected, as he's blind, this guy, as well, and I think that lends credence to he's not affected by he's got an intense memory. He was chosen for that. He's unaffected by other symbology because he's blind. So he learned this at a young age, didn't he, from his father?
Yes, he was one-eyed from childhood, and then he lost his second eye later in life.
Right.
And so he devoted his time to the study of his religion because, he was blind. He really couldn't do a lot of other things. Mind you, he was very respected on the cliffs of Bandiagara and Mali where the Dogon lived because he was so intelligent and he was known all over. And he was also an herbologist, and people would come to him to get medicine for their different ailments. Right, so he was, he kept Marcel Griol in line when you can see when you're reading Conversations with Ogatamali, if Griol starts going in a different direction, he tries to put him back on track. And he was a fascinating teacher.
Mm-hmm. Give us a little bit about written cultures versus oral cultures and what that aspect really the difference is like, because our written culture, we kind of find it hard to understand the definition of an oral culture and what it is in contrast to our own, I suppose.
Well, the language of the oral culture that is presented or the language of the oral culture that's presented in Conversations with Ogatamali mm-hmm. is all based on symbolism, and so you have to know what each of these symbols mean before you can really decipher what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And you only learn these symbols by interrelating the different stories and what it means in one story in comparison to another story, for instance. And what these symbols all have several different meanings. It's not just what you see at face value, which you would in a normal, like in a written culture, you read something and it's all chronological. It has a beginning and an end, and you just follow the story in this pattern. But this isn't how the Dogon religion was created. It's all over the place. It's interrelations
right
between all these different symbols, and it's like learning any language. It takes time to understand what all the different symbols mean. It really is like learning a foreign language.
Yeah, I guess it's just a different way of doing it, and it's kind of hard. That's what I'm trying to highlight, that it's hard for somebody who just has a written culture to understand that it's just another language and it's another way of doing it more than anything. I kind of find it difficult sometimes to, in my own mind, just to refer to them as either this as their religion or as their mythology or as their history, because I think mainstream academia would call this mythology. They might call it their religion, and overall it's really their history, I think. I know it's their religion. I know that's what it is to them, but this is history, this is history being unveiled, I think, Mm-hmm. Would that be an accurate way to describe that?
Yeah. The most of my research up to this point has been involved with the symbols associated with genetics and DNA and things of that nature. And one of the reasons Marcel Griol never understood the religion is because it is a lot of it is about genetics, and DNA wasn't discovered until the 1950s. So he had passed away before. DNA. I think it was Rosalind Franklin who first created the first photo of DNA in the early 50s, and then after she produced this photo, it was discovered, and so the fibrous skirt, which is an important symbol in the Dogon religion, is lost on Griol because he doesn't know what DNA is. We can understand it because we know what DNA is. And so this is a lot of the Dogon religion is based on science that we haven't even discovered yet. And I think as science starts to catch up with the Dogon religion, people will start to realize how significant this body of work is. And I'm just starting to learn more about the stars myself, because I didn't focus a lot of my research on that area mm-hmm. of the mythology, because Griel had asked Ogatameli in the book about the stars, and Ogatameli said to him, "Don't worry about that right now." He basically said, "The stars are symbols. We'll get to that, but you have to learn what all this other stuff means first." So I didn't spend a lot of time on the stars. I know a lot of other writers like Robert Temple talked about Sirius a lot, but recently.
I think that's an attractive thing for people to, when they hear that, their ears pop up and they go, "Oh my God, somebody knows about, complex astronomy." Yeah, I mean, that really kind of brings people attention. And I guess that's probably why they've been popularized as research now, but more so than that, like.
Yeah, and so it's just recently that I've started expanding into the pale fox and the star knowledge, because the pale fox is another body of work that was written by Germaine Dieterlen, and she was in Africa with Marcel Griel, and a lot of the book has his work and her work compiled together. And it's very difficult to follow unless you understand what the symbols mean. And the star knowledge, a lot of the star knowledge is in the pale fox. So it's just recently, and it really shocked me, because when I started studying it, I realized that this red star that Robert Temple believed was a red dwarf is actually a red giant. And this puts everything, it takes a whole different spin on the whole mythology when you start realizing, because this is a key symbol, and then it fits all these other symbols back into their proper place. And the Dogon tell us a story about our own solar system, and they tell us, and this is what the whole Sigu festival, the Sirius Sigu festival, is all about, these events that I'm about to tell you. And they happened about 250 million years ago. And the Dogon tell us that we once had two suns in our system. We have the sun we have now, and we had another sun that was an older sun. And this older sun was associated with both Mars and Venus. So, and I'm not a physicist. I don't know a lot about physics, but I'm just telling you what the symbols tell us. And the Dogon are telling us that there was life on Mars and Venus at this time. And the Nummo may have even come from Mars, because Mars is a female symbol in the Dogon religion. Right. So they tell us that we had these two suns in the solar system, and we also had another star that astronomers refer to as a protostar, and this is a star that hasn't yet become a sun yet. And it also existed in the solar system, and you had life on Mars and Venus. Well, everything's fine until this old sun, which they refer to as the little sun of women. So I don't think it was a big sun as suns go. And I think it was, like I say, associated with Mars, because Mars was a female symbol, and they called the sun the little sun of women. And this sun all of a sudden became a red giant. And what red giant stars are, for people that don't understand, is that our sun will become a red giant at the end of its lifetime. Yep. In billions of years. And when that happens, the sun starts to get really, really big, and it starts to engulf everything in front of it, and it ejects matter into the atmosphere. And from this matter, you get nebulae, which then go on to form new planets and new suns and so forth. So anyway, this sun became a red giant, and so they knew that eventually their world would be destroyed by this red giant, because they were fairly close to it. And so the scientist on Venus starts figuring out ways, what they can do to protect their world. And there's also life in the Orion constellation at the time, and the god Amma, who is a fairly relevant character in the Dogon religion, is associated with the Orion, the belt of Orion and the Orion constellation, and he is considered the oldest life form in the universe at that time, and the most advanced scientifically. And so, between Amma and this scientist, who they refer to as Ogo in the Dogon religion, they try to come up with some way to fix the problem. And you have to realize that these are individuals with science way, way more advanced than us. They talk about time travel and all kinds of things. So, this is beyond our ability to understand. But this guy on Venus is waiting for this guy in Orion to come up with something, and he's too slow. So the guy on Venus goes ahead and does this experiment. And what happens is Mars is pushed towards the sun, and a piece of Mars catches on fire, and it ends up falling onto the Earth. Now, I don't think there was intelligent life on the Earth at that time, but there was life on the Earth. And it apparently, this coincides actually with the Permian Triassic extinction event on Earth, which occurred about 252 million years ago. And it's called the Great Dying, and apparently it is the most extensive extinction event that's ever happened on the Earth. And
97% of life wiped out, I think, was it?
Yeah. And 70% of terrestrial vertebrate were wiped out, and it was the only extinction event where all insects were completely wiped off the Earth. So the Dogon tell us how this chunk falls into the north of the planet, and that all life headed southward, but eventually how most of or all of the life, they refer to all being destroyed. And so this life was also destroyed on this planet, Mars, and they refer to the planet Mars as Yasigu before this event. And then after this event, when life is destroyed, they refer to it as Yapunutolo. And it is associated with copper, and they refer to the symbol. This copper was a symbol of the Nummo as well in the Dogon religion, and they refer to it as something that never dies, that lasts forever, and that it's a symbol of things of the past, and this kind of thing. So then life is also destroyed eventually on Venus, and I don't know the time periods for these. As I say, the Dogon religion isn't really good about time periods. You have to piece it together based on the information you're given.
Yes.
And what we know is that Venus once had large bodies of water on its surface, and geologists believe this was similar to the Earth, and that this was wiped out about 300 million years ago, and Venus doesn't have any moons, which would fit with this theory of a red giant. And there's other scientists believe that Venus is exactly what will happen to the Earth when we become engulfed by a red giant, or by our sun down the road. So there's a lot of things pointing to the fact that this is a reality. And so anyway, what happens is this red giant this experiment messes everything up, and I don't know when the red giant, whether it explodes, whether it ejects matter. I don't know what happens, but it eventually ends up in the area what we know today as the Sirius star system. And this protostar that also existed in our system ends up there as well. And when it becomes a white dwarf, this red giant starts rotating around Sirius. And the Sigu festival, the moon was also formed at this time, they said, and it's associated with the ritual of circumcision in the Dogon religion, and the new moon is a symbol of the circumcision, and of course the chunk that falls off Mars is related to the circumcision, and the significance of circumcision is in the Dogon religion is because it's when humans are turned into single-sex beings, and according to the Dogon, the Nummo end up doing this over time because we lost our second son. And there's vibrations when suns are created, the soul, or these vibrations which are associated with, they use the musical octave as a metaphor for these vibrations. And they're found in all life. And apparently the sun, there's something about suns that have these vibrations in them, and they're connected to the soul. So when we lost our second son, we basically lost part of our soul, is how the Dogon describe it.
Right.
And that's why you have the jackal being, the single-sex male jackal being born, and he's born mortal, and he's completely severed from the Nummo spiritual essence. And what happens is, when the Nummo, when this planet is destroyed, this Earth, then the Nummo come to, or Mars, the Nummo come to Earth. And Ogatameli tells us the reason the Nummo came here in the first place was because their own world was dying, and I didn't realize that it was in our own solar system. And so they come to Earth, and they they combine their DNA, create life form on the Earth. And I really believe the Nummo might have been a form of dinosaur. And the reason I say that is because they describe the Nummo as having gizzards, and
I see you go into that, yeah.
And they're associated with birds, and birds are the only type of dinosaur, of course, existing to the present day.
Mm-hmm. You got some wonderful articles on your website, Shannon. Give out your websites, because you go into the creation of the sun, the red giant that you talked about, Emiatolo, and the Sirius B knowledge as well. So,
it's shannondory.com.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing you'll find on the website, I do show pictures of the Dogon drawings of the red giant ejecting matter. And NASA has taken pictures of red giants ejecting matter in other areas of the galaxy, or, I don't know how far out it goes, but they're identical to these drawings the Dogon did of these red giants. And, it's really quite amazing to see the similarities. And the Dogon also, one of the other things that's important in the Sigu festival is the fact that they talk about another red giant. The red giant symbolized the mistress of speech in the Dogon religion, and she sacrificed for the betterment of humanity. And so when these giants, eject their matter or explode or whatever, they're creating new life. So it's a constant regeneration. Mm-hmm. And so that's why this symbolizes her in the Dogon religion. And, I was telling about the situation with the dinosaurs. I'll maybe go back to that just for a second to try to explain where I'm headed with this. Mm-hmm. When the Nummo combine their DNA with the Earth animals, when they come to Earth, and they create this new life form, and I believe it's associated with the dinosaurs. Science has shown that the dinosaurs began on the Earth around 230 million years ago, and then they died out about 65 million years ago. And the Dogon talk about a rebellion by the Jacqueline males that are born like him, and they destroy the Earth again. And then that's when the Nummo finally leave again. And I believe that the destruction they talk about is what happened with the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And I talk about this in the Nummo, my second book, the Nummo. And the Ammonites are also destroyed in this destruction. And the Ammonites were a symbol of the god Amma from the Orion constellation. So I really believe that this event, we can't relate to these, to dinosaurs and Ammonites as having intelligence, because we assume intelligence with human beings. And of course, that isn't how it works in the universe. There's different life forms have different intelligence, sure, everybody evolves depending on their own planet. So anyway, when the Nummo leave the Earth finally after this event, they realize that things aren't going to work here because we've lost that sun, and it's just not working out. They go to the Pleiades star system, and it's in the Pleiades where the 8 ancestors are created, and where the indiscretion occurs, and they end up having to leave the Nummo's world, and these 8 ancestors are the ones, they're part Nummo and part human. And Oga Tamale tells us that humans actually came from the Pleiades, and it's possibly we were created there to help us with this problem on Earth with the fact that we have one sun. And this, we are an anomaly in the universe. NASA tells us that most solar systems have 2 and 3 stars. So
that's correct, yeah.
And so they tell us, that we came from the Pleiades, and they come back to Earth with us and the 8 ancestors. And when they come back, another red giant is involved in it explodes, or there's something about the red giant that happens. And when they're coming to Earth, the star Sirius A becomes a sun. And they see this when they're in the ship, and when they land on Earth, they actually see the first rising of Sirius A. And this is a really important thing, and it's part of the regeneration of the Earth because of these vibrations. And I think that this was supposed to help humanity, the fact that it finally became a sun. And when the ancestors come back to Earth, they bring all these seeds with them from life in Orion's belt, in the Sword of Orion, the Pleiades, and from Venus. So this tells us that they must have saved the DNA from Venus before it was destroyed. So they bring these seeds to the planet Earth.
Is that the idea of the Ark, then?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I believe it's the source of the myth about Noah's Ark, and. So they bring all this to the earth, and they clean up the earth after the previous devastation, and they create, new life. They instill and there's something about the seeds they bring with them that have these vibrations in them that are supposed to be beneficial to humanity. And this is all part of the regeneration. And when they when this red giant, which kickstarts this sun in Sirius, and I don't know if it was the red giant from Procyon, or from because there's a white dwarf there, or if it's the one from the Orion Nebula, because the mistress of speech was symbolized by the Orion Nebula as well. So I don't know where it happened, but when they landed, it was the same year that they had landed on Earth that this star exploded, and they saw it in the sky for 240 years before it finally disappeared. And when the star finally explodes, a piece of it is thrown onto the Earth into the area of Ghana, which is south of where Mali is. And it creates this lake bosom tree over, it puts this big hole in the ground, and then this lake forms from it. And this piece of this red giant that hit the Earth is associated with the heart of the mistress of speech, because she's symbolized by this red giant star, and so they equate this with her. And this whatever it was, rock that falls into this lake is associated with the anvil. And this is an important religious symbol in the Dogon religion, because the Nummo were known as heaven smiths, and the hammer of the smithy was a symbol of the male aspect of the Nummo, and the anvil was the female aspect. And so the two pieces together symbolize the androgynous nature of the Nummo. And so the anvil is the female, and this is what these rocks became in the culture, are anvils. And this sacred stone that it falls into Lake, what we know today as Lake Bosumtwi, is there's a village near this lake, and they call this the Stone of Adbridwam, and they create sacrifices on this stone. And there's also myths about a spirit living in this lake that's associated with the Nummo, because they refer to the lake as the antelope god, and the antelope was a symbol of the Nummo in the religion. So there's stories about the spirit living in the lake, and they can't take metal near the lake. They can only use wood. They can't fish with metal hooks, and they have wooden boats that they can only use on this lake because of this spirit that lives in the...
Strange.
Mm-hmm.
Strange.
And so
Shannon,
this...
Sorry,
yeah,
go on, Shannon.
yeah,
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say the Smith and the whole Smith mythology is, it's all over the world in different places, Egyptian and
Funny
Greek.
you mention that, because I remember watching an episodes of Ancient Aliens, and I have a few of them there. I did want to check it up because I was thinking about it. I was conscious of it. They refer to a smithy, a semi-aquatic mermaid metalsmith that came out of the water and taught the Babylonians metallurgy. They made reference to that in one of the episodes of Ancient Aliens.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the whole metal thing is a really big part of this whole religion. The Smith and it was part of the pagan religion. Even I don't know if you're familiar with there's a passage in the Bible where I can't think of the apostle's name. He's preaching Peter is preaching in this area of Turkey, I think it was, and it's the metalsmiths that come out and defend Artemis, the Greek goddess Artemis, against the Christian religion, because the metalsmiths are the key religious figures in these different cultures.
Yeah.
And so I found that interesting as well.
The history of metallurgy, I researched for my own work, and it's so murky. I mean, metallurgy, you go back to the earliest record of the Babylonians, historical written records, I guess. They have metallurgy there from day one, and metallurgy, the scientists believe that they chucked a piece of ore into a fire, and hey presto, metallurgy was born, because they could see the ore melt in two. And that just doesn't work. There's not enough heat in a campfire. Now, there is written records that metallurgy was given to people by metalsmiths, And
Yeah.
that's our earliest record of metallurgy. It's just so murky. It really is, like. But campfires just don't hold the heat to melt ores, even on the smallest ores. So.
Oh, I know. It's really amazing when you start looking at traditional history and trying to figure out how this all came together.
Yeah. You know, and that's the thing. It's not the book Master of Speech, Shannon. It's not just a book about mythology. It's effectively applied mythology with scientific and historical reference in places through artifacts, art relics, wall reliefs, carvings, scientific data, historical events. You know, how difficult was it to apply that mythology, or did that evolve naturally for you as you were researching going along? Did you see it as you were doing it, or?
Yeah, I guess it just sort of evolved, as one thing would lead to, as soon as you start understanding the symbols, you can see them all over the world. So it makes it a lot easier to realize, oh yeah, this is happening here and this is happening here. And, you start putting the pieces together. And for me right now, I've got all the one half of the puzzle with the genetics, and then I'm just working on the other half with the solar system, and they're starting to fit together. So, discovering this red giant was a real, a move forward for me, because it made me realize, like I said, a lot of different things that I hadn't been aware of before. And you see this all over the world with the Smith and these meteorites that people save and their religious objects. It's all related to these things.
Oh, is that not the Ben stone? Is that one? I think the Egyptians grabbed the meteorite and they called it the Ben stone.
Yeah. And, well, I talk a bit about that in the book, too, because they talk about the bird. There again, we're talking about birds. There's a lot of birds in on ancient artifacts, and the Nummo were described in very many different ways. The bird was one way, and, the Ben bird, and they were serpents, and they were fish, and Ogatameli most often referred to them as the serpent, so I think that's what they most resembled. They had horns or casts on their head. They were associated with chameleons, and they were also shapeshifters. They spent more time in water than on land, and of course they communicated using, I believe they communicated using sonar, and I talk about that in the Master of Speech, and how I believe that Egyptian hieroglyphs were the Nummo's way of trying to communicate their sonar analogs into something that humans could understand by, because you've got that left to right and right to left writing.
Yeah, that's something John Anthony West goes into in his Symbolist Tour of Egypt. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I do think that the hieroglyphs, they have a double meaning. There's an immediate meaning, but then there's a symbology behind the immediate written word, if you will, that it really does take both hemispheres of the brain to understand the whole concept. Yeah. Shannon, we're going to take a break there, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Okay, great.
And we're back on Capricorn Radio with your host, E.A. James Swagger. You here with us, Shannon?
Yes, I am.
Hey, welcome back. Yeah, Shannon, this is so fascinating, and there's so many aspects. There's the genetic engineering, as you say, and then there's also the astronomy, and it's such a complex religious mythology, if you want to call it that. And I always believe that, like, mythology, there's always a core of truth there. There's like, if maybe a large body of truth that's kind of been misconstrued by our modern perspective, if you will, like. And I think you basically unveil the layers, and you give us this complex web of mythology that we can kind of weave in and out through the book. Like, you do it very well in the narrative, I think, is what I'm trying to say. I guess I want to get into some themes, Shannon. Tell us about the anthill symbology in the Etruscan Omphalos stone, which has the lizard on it as well. All right.
Well, the Dogon, after the first experiment failed, the Nummo were working on trying to fix the problem, and the Nummo spaceship existed underground and underwater. I speculated in the Master of Speech that they may have been like other amphibians, like salamanders, who find the light sensitive to them. So they live under, the ground, and they only come out at night. And so the spaceship is associated with an anthill by the Dogon. And when the ancestors go to be regenerated in the Nummo spaceship, they go into the hole, which is at the top of this of the spaceship, and they go into the ground, and they're regenerated. And when they go inside the anthill, their body basically dies, and their soul still lives, and they incorporate this soul into the newly created body. So the anthill becomes a very important symbol because it's associated with, the death and rebirth sort of theme.
Right.
And it's also the spaceship, and it becomes the ant becomes a symbol of the earth, and humans basically, and the jackal is an ant. He's symbolized by the ant as well. So the anthill, I guess the spaceship must have looked like a giant anthill on the surface of the earth.
Yeah, tell us about the jackal, because I get a feeling he's the baddie of the story.
Yeah.
He doesn't sound like he's had a good run, does he? I kind of felt sorry for him in places, like when I read, because I'm like going, poor guy was detached. He was almost detached from everybody else, but he does get portrayed as the baddie, doesn't he?
Yeah. He's the male, as I mentioned a bit earlier. The Nummo were hermaphrodites, and when they first did their experiment, when hermaphrodites were born, they were born fine. They were born immortal, just like the Nummo. But and I equated them to the killifish, which are self-fertilizing amphibians on Earth, who I think procreated the same way as the Nummo. And every now and then one of these males is born to provide genetic diversity to the species. And this is what happened when one of these males was born. And he's, of course, a single-sex being, and he really symbolizes the first human. And or the first Earth animal is probably a better way to describe it. And he's born severed from the Nummo spiritual essence. He has no soul, basically. And he's a very destructive element in the religion. And Olga Tamelli says he did more things than can be known, or he did so many bad things that you can't even talk about it. And so so this is how come the male becomes a symbol of evil in the Dogon religion, and how you get this. And it's really not he's not a male per se, because he really symbolizes all humans, both male and female. Like he's a symbol of single-sex beings, as opposed to the Nummo, who were hermaphrodites and immortal. And so the jackal's born mortal, and this is the beginning of death on the earth. And this is, earlier I was talking about the Sigu festival, and this is what this is all about: the jackal and the male element. And this was a male ceremony because it symbolized the jackal. And he was a symbol of the moon, which was created earlier when I was telling you about the experiment. And he was a symbol of Venus, or Venus was a symbol of him, and the moon was a symbol, and so was the white dwarf star Sirius B. These celestial bodies all were a symbol of the jackal in the Dogon religion.
Sure. The DNA knowledge, the strands are on the skirt, is that correct? The skirts that
Yes.
they wear in the costumes in the dance that the dog...
That's right. Those, and I don't know, they describe them as thick tendrils that, hung down, and that masked men still wore them in Griot's day in this fashion. And this was the fibrous skirt, and this was the beginning of the twinning of Nummo with the earth. And so they describe it as this fibrous skirt that they place over the earth's genitalia. And when they do this, the earth is able to speak. In other words, they bring intelligence to the earth. And this is the first word, and the word is a very important symbol in the Dogon religion, because it symbolizes intelligence. It symbolizes the fact that the animals could now speak. And so the Nummos DNA helps humans or the earth animal create intelligence. And so that's where you get this image of the fiber skirt, and then you get this image of the cloth being a symbol of the word, because it's all related back to this fibrous skirt and the DNA.
Right. Fascinating, Shannon, fascinating. I want to get into the other theme of forbidden love, because this seems to originate with the Nummo as well, that they were forbidden to procreate, or the 8 ancestors, I think some of them were forbidden procreating. This forbidden love theme has seemed to have percolated through mythology, world mythology, if you will.
Yes, that's right. After the experiment failed, then when they went to the Pleiades, they end up creating another experiment, and they take the DNA from the jackal and the first hermaphroditic beings, and they combine them together, and they create 8 ancestors. And everything is fine in the Nummos world as long as these 8 ancestors follow the rules, and the rules are that they can only procreate with like, for instance, the first ancestor could only procreate with the 8th ancestor, and the second could only procreate with the 7th. And the reason being that the 7th ancestor was the master of speech, or the mistress of speech is how I refer to her now. And she had the perfect combination of human and Nummo DNA, whereas the second ancestor was most closely related to the jackal and the earth. And the ancestors, the first 4 ancestors, are considered male and more tied to the earth. Even though they're all hermaphrodites, the first 4 are considered male, and the last 4 are considered female and more associated with the Nummos world. And so in order to keep the bad DNA bred out of the ancestors, they have to be very careful, and so they follow these rules. And what happens is that the first 2 ancestors, who are both males but hermaphrodites, fall in love, and they have this relationship, and this messes up the program. And the Nummo would have been terrified, because their own immortality would have been affected by this. They feared that they would lose their own immortality if they didn't follow these rules. And so the mythology hints at the fact that one of these individuals becomes pregnant. And this is when you have the 8 ancestors returning to Earth, because the Ogatameli wasn't sure whether they got kicked out of heaven, as he referred to the Nummos world, or if they left on their own, and decided to make their return back here because they couldn't follow these rules anymore.
Is that the idea of the fallen angel? Perhaps?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Right.
I believe that's where this whole thing came from. And so they come back to Earth, and that's when they create the 3rd experiment and turn humans, because they realize that humans can't follow this, that they're not capable of following these rules, and that this is going to happen again, that it happened once and it's going to happen again. And so that's when they turn humans into single-sex beings, and they bring these plants, and they try to instill these vibrations in humanity so that we can find our way back to the truth. And so this is all involved in this process of this forbidden love that creates this humans basically losing their immortality. And of course, we see this in the Arthurian legends, which I talk a little bit about. In fact, I really focus on that in my second book, the Nummo.
Right.
And the whole theme of forbidden love is what Robert Graves tells us about the myths, the Arthurian legends, is that they were written based on Welsh religious myths, and that Mallory and the Trouvères had no interest in the religious meaning of the myths, but they just rewrote the stories to accommodate their time frame. So these love stories take on a whole different, they become male and female, and so the original religious stories become lost. And of course, in the Arthurian legends, you also have Nummo, the Lady of the Lake, who raises Sir Lancelot beneath the murky waters of her lake, and she creates the sword and the stone. And early versions of the sword and the stone, which is the hammer and the anvil, we see that Robert de Born writes about the sword and the stone, and it appears inside an anvil in the original stories.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so this is really the hammer and the anvil. And when you pull the sword from the stone, of course, in the Dogon religion, this symbolizes the severing of humans into single-sex beings. And so these same themes come through in these later stories. And it's all this story of forbidden love. And
yeah, you've got the Tristan and Isolde story as well. I know that because I used to live in Cornwall, and they have that embodied in themselves down there, that Tristan and Isolde fable.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, it's a Cornish. I don't know if it's a Cornish tale, but they call it their own anyway. They seem to. Yeah, you got the Celtic nations seem to adopt their each one's. Oh, that's our story, and that's, the Celtic nations are spread over 6 territories, but they seem to claim that one down there. I do remember that one. It's probably the one I remember the most, the Tristan and Isolde fable.
Yeah.
Tell us about the serpent-like with the right leg. They seem to have all their statues with the right leg, and they seem to, because of their tail. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. In the Dogon religion, because the Nummo didn't have 2 legs like humans, even the 8 ancestors had human upper bodies, but fish-tailed lower bodies. Mm-hmm. And they actually, because of these long tails, they actually moved on land like serpents, and that's how come they ended up with this being identified with a serpent. And as I mentioned, they spend more time in water than on land, and so to the Dogon people, they were considered handicapped because they only had 1 leg, and it was always identified with the right leg, never the left. Everything on the sanctuary that was associated with the Nummo always appeared on the right-hand side, and everything associated with the evil humans, the earth, the jackal, always appeared on the left side. So apparently the Nummo had this bulge around the end of their tail that looked like a bracelet. So Dogon women would put a bracelet around their right ankle to mimic this aspect of the Nummo. And the Nummo also had these bumps that protruded from their skin at the elbows and wrists, and possibly also the shoulders. And they had, and so the Dogon woman would wear these bracelets on around their arms to mimic these bumps. And the Nummo apparently also had lines on their bellies that were sort of, Ogatamala described it as these lines that formed a series of V's without points. But Dogon women also would have these tattooed on their bellies to mimic the Nummo.
And isn't that corroborated on the Ubaid figurines? Is that
yes, that's right. Yeah,
that's fascinating, because there's another tie-in with some artifacts where the Dogon mythology is telling us about these semi-aquatic fish gods who genetically engineered us, but they're in West Africa. But then, what they're talking about is on these ancient Babylonian Ubaid figurines.
That's right. Yeah. And they described them even with the casts on their heads. Like Ogatamala said, they had horns or casts, but you see these statues, and I think they date from 6,000 BCE, 4,000, something like that, and they have
really.
Yes.
That's fascinating, because Eric von Daniken in 1970s TV production Chariots of the God, I'm sure he uncovered some rock art in the Sahara Desert somewhere. Could it be Libya, Algeria? I'm not quite sure. And it's got 2 horns. It's got a creature with some horns that looks alien-like.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Nummo did have horns, or it's...
Like protruding nodules for horns.
Yeah, and you see this in Roslyn Chapel. I talk about that more in the second book, but there's pictures of Noah with horns on his head. Really? And that's why I believe the cow, you see cows with horns as symbols of the Nummo around different places, because the cow was a symbol of the Nummo. It was a symbol of the sun, and the word for cow was similar to the word for sun, and it was also similar to the word for mother in the Dogon religion. So the cow is a very important symbol of the Nummo. Specifically, they were associated with the color red because of the sun, and red cows and that.
Right, and I was telling you earlier that Newgrange, which seems to have these strange links with the Dogon, there's another one there where Newgrange basically means the place on the bend of the Boyne, but that basically actually translates as the place of the white cow.
Yeah,
basically.
that's amazing.
Yeah, I know you have this other significant link with, because I didn't know that until I read the Master of Speech that the Nummo were associated with the cow deity, which is most likely because of the horns. You reckon it's a direct physical attribute?
Yeah, it's the Dogon religion is strange because there's so many symbols that identify the Nummo. The cow is one, the serpent is another one, the horse actually is another symbol of the Nummo. The horse god, and you see the horse goddess appears in a lot in Celtic mythology.
Yeah, again in Cornwall they still reenact that today. Where if you go to the town of Penzance, they reenact this festival where this giant, well, he's a man in a costume. They usually get somebody who's tall, 6 foot, and he has a horse's skull on his head with a cloak on him when he comes out and reenacts a pagan ritual. They still do that today. Wow,
that's amazing.
Yeah, and they actually have revived this pagan ritual from texts. But they've been back doing it. They've reenacted it the last 30 years, I believe. But yeah, that pagan ritual to do with a horse, that's definitely down in the Cornish and Welsh regions, I think.
Well, the cow, of course, was also a symbol of the goddess Isis, and she was also depicted as a serpent on artifacts, early artifacts from Egypt. So I think she was all these goddess figures are related to the Nummo and to the mistress of speech in the Dogon religion.
Tell me about the Dogon masks, Shannon, because there's a dating technique, is there not? It doesn't exactly tell you how far back the Dogon goes, but I think each mask was made over a certain period of time, and when you add all the dating of the masks, you can tell exactly how far they go back or something? Yeah,
this is in reference to the Sigu ceremony
yes,
that I was talking to,
yeah.
and this ceremony is only held once every 60 years.
Right, that's it.
And so they start preparing for the next Sigu as soon as the one ends, and every day they do a little bit towards this 60-year festival. So they're preparing for it for 60 years,
Right.
and the life expectancy of the Dogon people, I think at that time, was like 38 years. So a lot of them would never live to see one of these festivals. But these masks that you're talking about, the Kanaga masks, would be created every time one of these festivals was, held. It would be finished, I should say, when at the end of the 60-year period. So every 60 years they would make one of these masks. And so when Griel and Dieterlin were doing the research in Africa, in a cave in Ibi where they stored these masks, they found 9 of these masks, and then they found 3 more that had crumbled to dust. And so they dated the Sigu ceremony back to the 13th century, based on the Dogon. And the Dogon had not always lived in this place of on the cliffs of Bandiagara. They had apparently fled there sometime between the 10th and 12th century because of their refusal to convert to Islam. So they had ended up there, and they were originated west of Bamako. Now that's one group of Dogon people, but there were others apparently that also came from the west of Africa that ended up in this particular location. So they did come from different areas, but this, they talked about these masks in reference to them having fled from Bamako, west of Bamako there.
So we know these masks go back to like Middle Ages, like.
Yeah, that's right.
To medieval, as some people say, like. And they actually, some of them are crumbling to dust. They're that old. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that when they were there, they found 3 that had. So they knew based on what they saw, there were 12 masks there that they saw, and those ones had started to crumble to dust. So there could have been ones before that they didn't see, right? Because they would have already disappeared.
I think it just highlights the antiquity of this religion, really. That it's at least it's one direction of the antiquity, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think time and time again throughout the book and your research, you seem to corroborate Babylonian tales with Dogon mythology time and again. Yeah.
Well, the Ubaid statues.
Yeah, and the fish costumes as well. The fish costumes are really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And the god Inki.
Yeah.
He eats 8 types of grain, which destroys his. These are fragments of the Dogon religion. The Dogon religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Dogon religion predates these other religions, and of course, they're all. These later religions are male-dominated religions too. So the symbols have been reversed a bit, but some of the artifacts are very significant because they do show these fish beings and these.
Sure, I mean, when you go into the British Museum, for anybody who's listening in this part of the world, you got to check out the wall reliefs of Babylonia. They have literally taken half of Iraq home to the British Museum, and you can walk down this corridor and you just see these wall reliefs of the Babylonian Empire, Sumerian, Akkadian, Syrian, and they have the fish costumes on them, and they're the most strangest looking things. Why anyone would wear this giant fish costume? The fish's head sits on the top of the crown, and the rest of the body is at the back, and there's some people actually reckon that that's the origins of the bishop's hat.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I go into that a bit in my last book, The Day of the Fish.
Right.
And because a lot of the symbols on the coat of arms of the current pope are symbols related to these events, and the bear and
he has a ring as well. He has a ring that's like a fisherman's ring or something.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the fish is a symbol of Christianity, right? Jesus walked on water, and so a lot of the symbols from the earlier religion were, and of course, the mistress of speech is sacrificed for the betterment of humanity, and and the fish symbol on the Pope's ring is apparently a picture of a hall of fishes, and the hat that is in the shape of the mitre.
Right.
And
did you think the church actually just adopted some pagan rituals, costumes, or do you think they have knowledge of this religion?
I think they have so many artifacts in the Vatican that I have to believe that they must know the truth.
Yeah, I tend to believe that, but then the jury's out sometimes. But I think that's what they want. They want to keep you like that, I think.
Yeah. When you study the Dogon religion, you realize how it really is a sad story. When it comes right down to it, humans are, we're an anomaly in the universe. We're not like other places, and we're losing. We've lost half our souls basically. And we're a failed experiment, and it's a lot of negatives. So, in some ways, I can understand why this was a mystery religion, because it was probably, how do you tell people that? How do you bring that to for people to acknowledge when they're a primitive culture just trying to survive day to day? You have to have something for them to believe in. So. Maybe that's why they didn't want this truth known. I don't know, but I'm quite certain. And of course, if you look at the Dogon religion, the male is considered the evil in the religion, and these are patriarchal religions we're talking about. Christianity is a patriarchal religion, so it goes against everything that is taught in the Dogon religion, right?
Right, exactly. I do think there's like secret orders know the truth as well, and I do believe that there may be truth to secret orders and the Christian church as well. The jury's out on that one too, as they say.
No, I agree with you. I'm sure there's got to be people on the earth that know the truth, and maybe they're just waiting for the right opportunity to make the truth known. But
I would like to think that, Shannon, but I don't think. I think it's more sinister plot than that.
Oh, well, it could be.
I would like to believe that they're going to release the knowledge one day when mankind is ready. I would like to believe that. I can understand why they would do that. Yeah, because if mankind wasn't ready, then don't release the knowledge. Yeah, but I don't think they want to release the knowledge. I think it's a control of humanity.
Well, that could be one thing that Dogon.
Speculation, but.
Yeah, one thing the Dogon talk about, they refer to the fourth word, and that's the three experiments, they're the three words, but then the fourth word is when humans learn everything about all the symbols in the Dogon religion, and they know the truth, and the science has caught up with the information that the Dogon present, and that's called the fourth word, and that's the good word, and that's supposed to be when we start to find our way back to the truth and immortality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Zechariah Sitchin, he wrote about the genetic manipulation of mankind through the Babylonian cultures, and I kind of don't agree with a lot of what he said in terms of he couldn't back up some of his tablets and what he translated. He couldn't point to the source material. But I think what the difference with your technique is, if you want to call it that, Shannon, is that you have really dissected the Dogon religion, the Dogon mythology, and you're applying it to world mythology and coming up with answers backed up with many aspects, and one of them is the Babylonian corroboration. So I'm not saying that the genetic manipulation is not true, what Zechariah Sitchin says is like, but just I don't agree with, he can't point to some of his sources like, but I think the genetic manipulation that you point to is more plausible, that it was a failed experiment, that there was a goodwill behind it initially, whereas the Zechariah Sitchin thing, we were supposed to be just slaves, like, so, it's less believable. I'm not too sure on that now. Do you know of Zechariah Sitchin's work?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't agree with what I've found in the Dogon,
No.
so it's hard for me to, and I know that the Dogon predates it based on my research.
Yeah, well, that's I guess what I'm trying to highlight is, that it predates it, and it's the source religion, if you want to call it that.
It became corrupted when these patriarchal cultures take over, because they start reversing all the symbols. So it's hard to know. The truth was probably there before this started happening, and they became written. We were talking about written culture again. So the Dogon were still an oral culture when it was recorded. So to me, that oral cultures are the oldest cultures in the world. So this is another reason why I think the Dogon predates these other cultures.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the myth of Prometheus, because I watched that film Prometheus not too long ago, Shannon. Did you watch that film?
Yes, I did actually.
I'm not really a movie buff, but I did happen to watch that quite recently, like, so I think they kind of took a lot of ideas out of that.
Yeah. Well, I talk about the Promethean myth because it's about the stolen fire, and of course this is what happens in the Dogon religion with the jackal when he rebels against the Nummo. He steals the fire, but the fire is also a symbol of the DNA and the things that happen to the earth that with the failed experiment. So there's a lot going on, and this story about Prometheus in Greek mythology is based on, I believe, the Dogon story of the jackal and the stolen fire. And unfortunately, when we get to Greek mythology, you get fragments. And if you know the basic symbols, you can sort of pull the fragments in and understand how they relate to the Dogon religion. And you get the figure of Hermes, I can't think of his name. Hermes, yes. Yeah. And he's a jackal figure as well, and of course he steals 50 immortal cows from the sun god, and the cow is a symbol of the Nummo. So, and he's also the first to light a fire. Well, in the Greek you get these bits and pieces of this myth, but you don't understand, well, how are they connected? Well, the Dogon religion tells us that the fire is the DNA. The Dogon religion tells us that the cow is a symbol of the Nummo, and that the DNA that's stolen is basically the Nummo's DNA, and that the Nummo's DNA becomes a part of the earth. And there's this twinning of the Nummo with the earth animals is a very important theme in the Dogon religion, because once this happened, it was like they couldn't change it. They couldn't take it back. It was like it was permanent, and they had to figure out how to deal with it at that point.
Sure. Okay, Shannon, we're at the top of the hour here. I love what you do. The work's very important, and again, you seem to just do a beautiful job on dissecting world mythology and tying it in with this complex web of Dogon mythology. And I think it's just a good application of this source religion, really. And I think it's a very hard thing to do. And it's a very hard thing to orate on a radio show as well. So
Yes,
I thank you for your time, Shannon. I really do.
Oh.
You've been very elaborate on the concepts. Just give out your websites again there before we go, Shannon, if you could.
Yes, it's shannondory.com.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say that my books are available for sale from my website, and that's the only place you will get the current versions of the book, because I am constantly updating the books as new information becomes available.
Sure, and I'm going to have you linked up on the guest biography page too, Shannon. So it's been a pleasure having you, and you're going to come back and talk about your latest work, The Day of the Fish, hopefully sometime in the near future, yeah?
Okay, sure.
Well, it's a pleasure having you, Shannon. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
That was Shannon Dory delivering the knowledge of the Dogon and their teachers, the Nummo, the semi-aquatic fish gods. Such fascinating material, albeit strange and incredible. I have another Dogon researcher coming up on the 10th of February, Mr. Lard Scranton, who's going to get into some of the Dogon scientific knowledge that they possess. That's all for now, folks. I got Dr. Robert Schock tomorrow discussing his book, Forgotten Civilization, and the tie-in with solar outbursts. And I believe we'll be getting into some details on the dating of the Sphinx, no doubt. So do stay tuned to your host, E.A. James Swagger, on Capricorn Radio. And don't forget to subscribe, folks.
So to speak, in an oral culture. So my research shows that this is basically the oldest religion in the world. I've compared it against other religions, and to me this is the most important historical source document we have in the world today, because it was recorded when the religion was still being practiced, and it was recorded in a language that we can understand today. We're not dealing with dead languages. We're not dealing with artifacts and trying to piece together what happened based on fragments that we pull out of the ground. This came right from this Dogon elder who knew his religion, who was teaching it the way it had been taught to him. So this is a very important historical record.
Sure, and I think the significance of the Dogon religion and culture that I synchronise with the sense of importance portrayed in the book, Shannon. I really did very early on. I don't think you can emphasise that enough. The significance of what these guys have to tell us, and the fact that it against all the odds, it survived,
Yeah. Well, it was stamped out of most places in the world because the importance of this religion is that the Nummo, who are these amphibious aliens that the Dogon talk about, were hermaphrodites, but they were associated with the sacred feminine. And we know from research of Maria Gimbutas and Joseph Campbell, Robert Graves, and others that the earliest religions in the world were worship the goddess. So this is a very old religion, and unfortunately in most places of the world, Joseph Campbell referred to this in his books, that these symbols become reversed because he talks about these warring tribes, these patriarchal tribes that come down and they conquer these peaceful goddess worshipping civilizations, and they don't like the fact that the female is the main deity, so they reverse all the symbols. And when you reverse these symbols, you lose the fact that the Nummo were hermaphrodites. And the female becomes designated to the symbol of the moon, which in the Dogon religion is associated with the single-sex male and the first human, and the evil in the Dogon religion, who is identified with the jackal. And so Joseph Campbell refers to this period in history as solarization, where you have the reversal of all these symbols. And unfortunately, when Marcel Griol was recording the religion, he identified the Nummo as male. And he admitted he never really understood the religion. And it's fortunate for us that he did record it fairly accurately, because the symbols are there. And the symbols tell us that the Nummo were female deities.
You mentioned Marcel Griol there. Just for the listeners, Shannon, let's go back to their research, because this is where I think the story and the dedication and research starts for you, because, as you say, the conversation with Ogo Tameli, stuff that has happened after that event probably, and Marcel Griol's research probably gets somewhat affected by modern society, and for you, that's where the core of research really starts. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, part of the problem was that because he didn't identify the Nummo as female, that this research has sort of gotten lost. There aren't a lot of scholars working on the Dogon religion, which is tragic because to me it's the source religion. And Marcel Grill can't be faulted for that because he grew up in a patriarchal culture himself. I mean, when the French took over this area of Africa, the Dogon probably knew that their time was limited, and pretty soon they wouldn't be able to practice this religion. So Marcel Griol had lived amongst them for 15 years, and he kept trying to figure out the basis of the religion, and they would be vague about certain points. So it was only in 1946 that they actually told him the core symbols of this religion, and he never really did ever understand the Dogon religion. He admitted that. He recorded it as Ogutameli told it to him, but he never understood it. And part of this is because it came from an oral culture, and the symbols are what tell the story. It doesn't follow a chronological pattern the way we are used to reading stuff. Right. It's interrelated through the symbols, and I believe it's a metaphor for immortality because everything is interrelated. Time is really insignificant, and it's hard from that regard to identify certain time periods. You have to piece it together. It's like a giant puzzle that you have to try to figure out.
Hi everybody, and welcome to this edition of Capricorn Radio, broadcasting today from the town of Bushmills. Our aim here at Capricorn Radio is to discuss topical science, ancient history and historical mysteries in an effort to unveil our true cultural blueprint. If you haven't checked out the website just yet, please do so at capricornradio.com, and there you can subscribe for show releases, news updates and follow the links on the homepage for Facebook, YouTube and the podcast channel. All shows will be archived on capricornradio.com, and you can check out upcoming guests, their biographies, and please get in touch there if you have any comments or guest suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Today I'll be discussing the work of Shannon Dory, an academic researcher of the Dogon Tribe in West Africa. The Dogon have been popularised by Robert Temple in his book The Sirius Mystery and their links to star knowledge. So let me see, can I get Shannon Dory on the line? So I have with me now on the line Shannon Dory, author of The Master of Speech, The Nummo and Day of the Fish, a Dogon research trilogy of books. Shannon's provided a wealth of information on the Dogon through her own unique research. There isn't a lot of people who have researched the Dogon, so let me see if I got Shannon on the line. Hello, Shannon.
Hi there. How are you today?
Good. Welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Thank you.
Shannon, just before we get into any details, I'm going to just want to go through some of your background and what got you into Dogon research, really.
Well, I began my career as a journalist, and I have a combined history and English degree from Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, in Canada. Mm-hmm. I became interested in religious studies when I took a course on the New Testament at the University of Windsor in 91. And I've always had an interest in ufology. My father was a lawyer for the Canadian Air Force, and he was interested in aliens, extraterrestrials, UFOs, things of that nature, and this passion of his rubbed off on me. So I kind of had this interest in this, and when I was researching an article on Y2K back in 1999, I happened to stumble across a website that talked about the Dogon, and this was my first introduction to the Dogon people. And this website talked about the fact that the Dogon had advanced knowledge of the solar system. And they particularly referred to Sirius B, which is the white dwarf star that rotates around Sirius A. Mm-hmm. And the Dogon knew all the properties of this star, and that it was small and it was heavy and white. And they told the anthropologists back in the 30s and 40s that they had got this knowledge from amphibious beings who came from the stars to Earth. And it was this information about this white dwarf star, and this star is so difficult to observe even through a telescope that no photographs were taken of it until 1970, but the Dogon knew everything about it. And so this inspired me to order Marcel Griol's book Conversations with Ogutameli. Right. Now, this book was recorded in 1946 by the French anthropologist Marcel Griol, and he recorded it in 33 days. And the Dogon elder that taught it to him was Ogatamali, and he had been introduced into this religion when he was 15 years old, and by his grandfather, and then after his grandfather passed away, his father had taken over the instruction, and according to Marcel Griol, it went on for over 20 years. So this gives you some idea of the complexity of this religion. It was created in an oral culture. The symbols in Conversations with Ogatamali are the main symbols of this religion, and you can't read this book like you would read literature in our culture, because this is totally different. It's an oral culture, and it's all about the symbols and memory work and how these symbols interrelate with other symbols. And you have to realize that this is all memory work. This religion was passed on through these stories, through memorization, and so, it's quite involved, and, this was the only game in town. This would have been their only source of literature, how it all fits into the history.
In the book Conversation with Ogatamali, let's talk about this guy, Ogatamali, because inevitably the structure of the oral history is kind of somewhat unaffected, as he's blind, this guy, as well, and I think that lends credence to he's not affected by he's got an intense memory. He was chosen for that. He's unaffected by other symbology because he's blind, so he learned this at a young age, didn't he, from his father?
Yes, he was one-eyed from childhood, and then he lost his second eye later in life.
Right.
And so he devoted his time to the study of his religion because, he was blind. He really couldn't do a lot of other things. Mind you, he was very respected on the cliffs of Bandiagara in Mali, where the Dogon lived, because he was so intelligent, and he was known all over. And he was also an herbologist, and people would come to him to get medicine for their different ailments. So he was, he kept Marcel Griol in line when you can see when you're reading Conversations with Ogatamali, if Griol starts going in a different direction, he tries to put him back on track, and he was a fascinating teacher.
Mm-hmm. Give us a little bit about written cultures versus oral cultures, and what that aspect, really the difference is like, because our written culture, we kind of find it hard to understand the definition of an oral culture and what it is in contrast to our own, I suppose.
Well, the language of the oral culture that is presented in, or the language of the oral culture that's presented in Conversations with Ogatamali is all based on symbolism, and so you have to know what each of these symbols mean before you can really decipher what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And you only learn these symbols by interrelating the different stories and what it means in one story in comparison to another story, for instance, and what these symbols all have different